I want to tell you about a July morning a few years back that completely changed how I think about gardening. I was standing in my garden with a hose in my hand, same as I'd done every summer for over 30 years, watching the water run and knowing full well that by 3 o'clock that afternoon, half my plants would be drooping again. I was tired, I was frustrated, and I was looking at my water bill wondering if I was growing vegetables or just pumping money into the ground. That same week, I happened to be visiting Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I found myself standing next to an Amish vegetable plot that was the greenest thing I'd seen all summer. It was August. It had been dry for 3 weeks, and those plants looked better than mine did in June. No hoses, no sprinklers, no irrigation tape, and yet somehow they were thriving. Now, I'm going to say something carefully here, because I know how this sounds. It's easy to say the Amish don't water their gardens, and that's a bit of an oversimplification. They do water sometimes, especially when establishing seedlings or during extreme drought. But here's the truth that matters. They water far, far less than any conventional gardener I've ever met. They've built their gardens around moisture retention instead of irrigation. And the difference it makes is not subtle. It's the kind of difference that makes you feel a little foolish for all those years you spent dragging a hose around every evening. I started asking questions that day. I talked to the farmer whose garden I was admiring. I visited a few more farms over the next several months, and I began to understand something that had never occurred to me in all my years of reading gardening books and watching videos. The problem wasn't that I wasn't watering enough. The problem was that I had been watering so much, I had trained my plants to be weak and my soil to be lazy. That sounds like a bold claim. Let me explain what I mean, because this is where the real secret lies, and it's not about deprivation, it's about design. The Amish don't water because they've designed their gardens to not need it. And the first step of that design is something that I completely ignored for most of my life. They keep their soil covered. Always. From the moment they plant until the snow flies, every inch of soil is under a thick blanket of straw, hay, leaves, or compost. And that one practice changes everything about how water behaves in a garden. When soil is exposed to the sun and wind, it loses moisture at an astonishing rate. We're talking about inches of water evaporating in a single hot week. But covered soil stays cool, damp, and alive. The mulch prevents the surface from baking into a hard crust. It gives rain and whatever water you do provide a chance to soak straight down instead of running off. And underneath that mulch, the soil life thrives. Worms and fungi and bacteria create the microscopic channels and pores that hold water like a sponge. That's not folklore, that's soil science that's been documented in agricultural research for decades. But it took me seeing it with my own eyes in an Amish field during a dry spell to finally believe it. I spent my first year trying to copy what I'd seen. I laid down 4 inches of straw around my tomatoes and peppers. I planted in shallow basins to catch what little rain we got. I watered deeply, but only when the plants really needed it, maybe once a week instead of every day. And by the end of that season, I had saved a fortune on my water bill, and my plants were healthier than they'd ever been. But I made plenty of mistakes along the way, and I want to be honest about those too. The first year I mulched too early, and the soil stayed too cold, and my peppers were slow to get going. The second year, I used hay that had weed seeds in it and spent half the summer pulling grass out of my tomato beds. You learn, you adjust. And every season gets better. What I'm describing here is not some magical overnight fix. It's a system that you build gradually, one season at a time. And that's worth understanding, because a lot of people hear about this Amish method and they try it for one summer, don't see dramatic results, and give up. That's a mistake. The real power of this approach shows up in year 2 and year 3, when the organic matter has built up and the soil structure has transformed. Let me get into some of the specifics now, because I want you to understand that this isn't just some old wives' tale that gets passed around garden forums. There's real science behind why these methods work, and once you understand the science, it changes how you think about water in your garden. We talked about keeping the soil covered, and that's the foundation. But the second piece of this system is something that surprised me even more. It's about roots. The average garden plant has roots that stay in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. Why? Because that's where the water is. We water shallowly and frequently, so the roots have no reason to go deeper. They hang out in that top layer, they get their easy drink, and they stay there. The problem is that top layer is also the first to dry out. On a hot summer day, the top few inches of soil can go from wet to bone dry in a matter of hours. And when that happens, your plants wilt. They droop. They look like they're dying. And what do? We grab the hose and water again. It's a cycle. We water, the plant roots stay shallow, the soil dries out fast, the plant wilts, we water again. It's exhausting and it's unnecessary. The Amish break that cycle by watering deeply but infrequently. They give the soil a good soak, maybe once a week, maybe even less if they've had rain. And that deep watering pushes the roots downward. A tomato plant that's been trained to send roots 2, 3, or even 4 feet down can access moisture that's been stored deep in the soil, moisture that doesn't evaporate in the afternoon sun. Those deep roots make the plant resilient. They can go a week or more without any surface moisture because they're drinking from reserves that shallow-rooted plants can't reach. That's a key distinction that I think a lot of gardeners miss. We talk about watering plants, but really we should be talking about watering soil. If you water the soil deeply and build its capacity to hold water, the plants take care of themselves. This is where I want to address a concern that I know some of you are probably thinking right now. I can hear the skepticism. What about sandy soil? What about clay soil? What about someone gardening in Arizona versus someone in England? Those are fair questions. They're valid. And the truth is, this system looks a little different depending on where you live. I'll be honest with you. I live in a part of the country that gets decent rainfall through most of the year. I've had summers where I barely watered at all after June. But I've also talked to gardeners in drier climates who've adapted these same principles to their conditions. In a hot, dry region like Arizona or Texas, you might need to double your mulch depth, 6 inches instead of 3. You might also need to plant in sunken beds or swales that capture every drop of rain that falls. In wetter climates like England or the Pacific Northwest, the challenge is sometimes too much water, not too little, and the principles shift a bit. You might focus more on drainage and raising beds while still using mulch to moderate soil temperature. The underlying principle remains the same, though. If you keep your soil covered and you build its organic matter, it will hold more water than bare soil. That's universal. The exact application varies, but the science holds across almost every climate. Now let me share a mistake I made that I think a lot of you might relate to. When I first started learning about this, I was so excited about reducing my watering that I went too far the other way. I stopped watering entirely for a few weeks in July, convinced that my mulch and deep roots would carry the garden through. They didn't. Some of my plants struggled. My squash looked terrible. My peppers dropped their blossoms. I had to go back to watering once a week to keep things going. The lesson I learned is that you can't just quit cold turkey if your soil isn't ready. You have to build the system first. You need the organic matter, the mulch, the deep roots, the right varieties. And that takes time. The Amish didn't build these gardens in a year. They've been working the same soil for generations. The good news is, you don't need generations to see results. You can see a meaningful difference in 1 season, a noticeable improvement in 2, and by 3 years, if you stay with it, your garden will be a completely different animal. Let me walk you through exactly what I do now, year after year, in my own garden. And I want to be specific here, because general advice is easy to give but hard to follow. Specifics are what actually help you change what you're doing. The first thing I do in the spring is prepare my soil without tilling. I used to rototill every year, and I thought I was doing the right thing. Tilling makes the soil look nice and fluffy on the surface, but it destroys the structure underneath. It breaks up the fungal networks, it kills the earthworms, and it creates a hard pan just below the tiller depth that water can't penetrate. Now I just loosen the top few inches with a garden fork, mix in a couple of inches of compost, and leave it alone. The second thing I do is plant in basins. For every single transplant, I dig a shallow depression about 18 inches wide and 2 or 3 inches deep. The plant goes right in the middle. That little depression catches rain and holds it long enough to sink down into the root zone. It's a tiny thing, but it makes a huge difference over the course of a season. The third thing is mulching. I lay down 3 to 4 inches of straw around every plant. Not grass clippings by themselves because they mat down, but straw is perfect. It lets water through, it shades the soil, and it slowly breaks down into organic matter. I keep the mulch a couple of inches away from the stems to prevent rot, but every other inch of soil is covered. Now let me talk about variety selection, because this is where a lot of gardeners get caught up. I know the catalogs make everything look good, but if you want your garden to perform in dry conditions, you have to choose varieties that were bred for those conditions. For tomatoes, I grow mostly indeterminate varieties, like Brandywine and Cherokee Purple. They have sprawling root systems that go deep. I also grow Amish paste, which I was given by a farmer in Lancaster County, and it is remarkably drought tolerant. For beans, I've switched almost entirely to pole beans. The root systems on pole beans go much deeper than bush beans, and they keep producing through dry spells. For squash, I mostly grow winter squash like butternut and Hubbard. They have deeper roots and tougher leaves than summer squash, and they handle dry weather much better. I still grow a few zucchini plants because I like them, but I don't depend on them for my main harvest. Now, I want to make a note here about pruning. I mentioned earlier that pruning can help with water use, but I want to be careful about this because not all tomatoes should be pruned the same way. If you're growing determinate tomatoes, bush varieties that ripen all at once, pruning to a single stem is a bad idea. It will reduce your yield significantly. If you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, the vining kind that keep growing all season, pruning to 1 or 2 main stems is effective and helps the plant put its energy into fruit instead of leaves. The key is knowing what you're growing and treating it accordingly. That's the kind of nuance that I think older gardeners appreciate. It's not one size fits all. You have to observe, adapt, and learn from what you see in your own garden. One of the most rewarding things about this system is watching the garden become more resilient over time. The first summer I tried this, I still watered once a week, sometimes twice if we had a hot stretch. The second summer I watered every 10 days. By the third summer I had stretches where I didn't water for 2 weeks, and the garden looked fine. The fourth summer was the real turning point. We had a dry August, and I went on vacation for 10 days. I came home expecting the worst. My neighbors had watered their gardens while I was gone, but they'd forgotten a few beds. I was sure my tomatoes would be dead. Instead, I walked out and found them still producing. Not as heavily as they would have with rain, but still healthy, still green, still setting fruit. That was the moment I realized I had changed something fundamental in my garden. I had built a system that could take care of itself. And I want to be honest with you, because I know how this sounds. I've heard people make claims about their gardens that seemed exaggerated. I don't want to do that to you. My garden is not perfect. I still lose plants sometimes. I still have pests. I still get dry spots where the mulch wasn't thick enough. But the overall system is so much stronger than it used to be that I can't imagine going back. I don't spend my evenings dragging a hose around anymore. I don't worry about water bills. I don't panic when the forecast calls for a dry week. That freedom is worth more than I can easily describe. Let me bring this back to where I started, because I think it's important to remember why any of this matters in the first place. I didn't set out to become someone who cares about soil moisture and mulch depths. I started gardening because I wanted good food. I wanted tomatoes that tasted like they came out of a story. I wanted to grow something with my hands and watch it become real. And somewhere along the way, the joy of that got buried under a daily chore. Watering. Every evening, rain or shine, I was out there with a hose. If I went on vacation, I had to ask a neighbor to take over. If I got home late from work, I had to drag myself out in the dark to keep the garden from wilting. It wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a job. And that's not why I started gardening. I think a lot of you probably understand that feeling. You love your garden. You love the results. But the work can wear you down. It can make you wonder if it's worth it. The Amish taught me that it doesn't have to be that way. They've been growing food for over 300 years without irrigation, without sprinklers, without timers and drip tape. Not because they're trying to prove something, but because they had to find a way to grow food that didn't require constant attention. They figured out that if you build the soil and protect it and let the plants do what they were designed to do, you don't have to be out there every evening. You can step back and let the garden work. And I want to say something about that word work, because I think we use it wrong when we talk about gardening. We talk about how hard we work in our gardens, how much labor it takes, how we have to fight the weeds and water the plants and battle the pests. And all that is true, to a point. But the Amish understand something that modern gardeners often miss. The soil is alive. It works. The plants are alive. They work. The insects and fungi and bacteria are alive. They work. And when you set up the system correctly, all of those living things work together. You don't have to do everything yourself. You just have to create the conditions for the system to thrive. That's the shift I want you to make. Stop thinking of your garden as something you have to fight, and start thinking of it as something you can guide. Stop being the slave and start being the steward. Now, I'm not going to give you a list of 10 steps here. I know how that sounds. I've read those articles. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, check the box. It feels like homework, not gardening. Instead, I want to give you one thing to try this season. Pick one bed, just one. It can be your tomato bed, your squash bed, any bed where you want to see what happens. Mulch it 4 inches deep with straw. Plant in shallow basins. Water it deeply but only once a week, maybe even less if it rains. And then let it go. Watch what happens. Compare it to the bed next to it that you're still watering the old way. I think you'll be surprised. I think you'll see a difference that makes you want to try it on the rest of your garden next year. And I want you to know that it's okay if it doesn't work perfectly the first time. I made plenty of mistakes. I still make mistakes. That's how you learn. But I also want you to know that if you stick with it, if you give this system the time it needs to build, the payoff is real. 5 years ago, I couldn't leave home for 2 days without worrying about my garden. Last summer, I spent 10 days visiting my grandchildren, came home, and my tomatoes were still producing. That's when I realized I hadn't just changed my garden. I had gotten my summers back. And that's what I want for you. I don't want you to be out there dragging a hose around every evening. I want you to enjoy your garden again. I want you to taste the difference that comes from plants that have to work for their growth. The depth of flavor that you can only get from a plant that's not overwatered. I want you to step away from the noise of all those products and gadgets and promises and find something simpler that actually works. The Amish have known it for generations. Now I'm passing it along to you. If this changed how you think about watering, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you've tried, what's worked, what hasn't. And if you want more of these deep dives into traditional gardening wisdom, hit subscribe. I've got a lot more of these coming. Thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.